Accenture, AbbVie, Astellas, Boehringer Ingelheim, and Bluebird Bio. What do all these well-known biopharma companies have in common? Well, they've all had the privilege of leveraging the encyclopedic regulatory expertise amassed by one Scott Cleve, who spent nearly the entirety of his going on 25-year career directing the regulatory compliance and global regulatory relationships for the companies he's worked for. He's currently VP of Regulatory Operations and Compliance at Bluebird Bio, and he's our guest on today's episode of The Business of Biotech. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Matt, and thanks for the kind words as an introduction.
My pleasure. Also joining me today to query Scott on, you guessed it, all things biopharma regulatory related is my friend, colleague, and frequent co-host, Erin Harris, chief editor over at cellandgene.com. Erin, it's great to see you.
Thanks, Matt. Same to you.
Yeah. So, Scott, as I said, I mean, regulatory operations has been your bailiwick for, seemingly ever, pretty much from the outset of your career in pharma. And I want to start just by learning a little bit more about where that's rooted, learning a little bit more about you and kind of where that interest comes from, and even more pointedly, how you've maintained focus on that, exclusive role for all these years.
Well, I think that really stems from coming out of school. So I was a public accounting major. Mm-hmm. I actually had no idea what regulatory affairs was at the time, and I went into consulting. So my first consulting gig was at Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture. So I'm dating myself a little bit. And part of the reason for that was to have a variety of experiences, not only with technology, with clients, with working with different teams and different locales, but I think that's something that's always driven me is how do I bring change into the workplace, and how do we benefit from it as an organization, as a group, in the people I manage and mentor, and growing their careers as much as mine. So I think, now fast forwarding into the reg ops space, it's always changing. There's nothing that ever stays status quo. I mean, you can argue some things, maybe like electronic paper and PDFs right now. But, right now we deal with regulation change, and that's globally. So it's just not FDA, it's EMA, it's countries all over the world. It's technology change, which is going faster than we can often keep up with. And it's organizational and people change. So people are coming, going, organizations are shifting. So there's always a challenge in leading an organization, setting a vision, and trying to ensure we're doing the right things as a company, we're doing the right things for our people. And in the end, in the pharma biotech space, is how do we get these, frankly, incredible therapies and drugs to patients that can be life-changing. So there's a lot there that just is continuously challenging me. I feel like I'm always learning, which is a great place to be.
Yeah, no, don't take any offense to this, but it's certainly more exciting than accounting.
Yeah, I agree. I spent exactly 0 time in accounting, so I'll go along with that.
Scott, you mentioned as you were, explaining your response just there, you used the word change probably 10 times. So that leads right into my question, which is, the regulatory landscape has changed quite a bit in the time that you've been in the space. And so what are some of the biggest regulatory changes you've witnessed over your tenure in the space?
So I think the first and most obvious is, as I came into the space, we were still submitting in paper. And I think if you've talked to other people in publishing or operations or regulatory back in the late 90s, early aughts, everyone had their picture with the pile of boxes that they were shipping off to FDA or EMA, and all the time it took to compile those. And I think one of the things about that is it was tangible. You had this output of the work that the organization did for their drug development. And the big change now is it's electronically transferred to the agency. And and I hate when people do this, but you simplify it as you gather all of this data and information, you organize it appropriately, you connect it for agency review, and you essentially transmit it through a gateway to the agency. So it's an equal amount of work, but it's just less visible. And and all of the tools and standards that went into coming from paper-based to electronic have really moved the industry forward. It's been a huge leap. And I think you see the reliance on data, so going from documents to now data points, and that becoming a priority for FDA and other agencies. EMA starting to lead the charge on that in many aspects, and really starting to hone our focus on what's important for drug development and the safety of patients. So I think that's been a continuum since I joined a regulatory organization, is really seeing how we've moved from broad concepts of making sure we summarize our information and we communicate our messaging to, we need to ensure that these data points in our CMC information and our clinical information are correct and validated, and we can get those accurately and in a timely fashion to the health authorities.
It's interesting to talk about change and rapid change at that in the context of a conversation around working with in the FDA's case, a federal regulatory agency, right? Mm-hmm. So just a side question, is that change from your perception being driven more by the agency itself or more by industry, or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination, and it's sort of like a push and pull in a lot of ways, where the agency has certain information or data that they expect in a certain way, so they can then leverage technology on their side to process it quicker. How do they get that data into the reviewer's hands so they can start to analyze it and make their own conclusions? And so when they provide those standards to industry, we have to react. And how do we get this information to them? But I think also from the outside, there's obviously a number of new technologies that have come into play. And if you go into just a broad example of like wearables, now we have your watch or a wristband or a necklace or patches that can give you information. So how can we take sort of this real world evidence and provide it to the health authority to either support drug development or to provide evidence that our therapies are actually working? So now they have to react to what's in the public and make those adjustments. So I think it kind of goes both ways, but I think the quicker adoption is often when the health authority says, we have a mandate. We want this data or this information in this way. And now, we've got to figure out the most expedient way to provide it to them.
Yeah. So that's an example of something that hasn't changed per se, right? The fact that there's a mandate and you need to oblige. What else hasn't changed so much? We talk about all the things that do change, but again, we're working with we're working in terms of governmental regulatory agencies. Certainly some things haven't changed. Maybe some things should change that haven't changed. What's your take on that?
So I'll stay within my area of expertise. And as I mentioned at the start, we're still transmitting electronic paper to the agency for 80 or 90% of the information we want to convey in a submission. And if you look at that, thank God for Adobe and PDF. And they've made it very easy to securely send information in a document format. And we've leveraged that for 20 plus years, and we haven't made an advancement past that. And at a certain point, there needs to be a move to more structured information. And I think when you look at Europe's requirements with SPOR and IDMP, we're starting to get more granular. FDA has additional data requirements, certainly on the clinical side, but also things like PQCMC, where we're trying to drive from a document structure to a data structure. So I think the thoughts of moving in that direction are there. It's just how quickly can we move there? And I think we'll get more efficiency in providing information, allowing the health authorities to do their jobs quicker, because essentially they're evaluating this information for the public good in providing these drugs and the safety of these drugs. But I think that's like one of the things you just wish could go a little bit quicker. How do we get adoption? And I don't think there's anyone to blame. It's just, that change in how we convey information just takes a long time, because we as humans, we process information kind of in a summary fashion. We're not a machine just reading, XML bytes or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of speed. So this, I'm interested in your particular perspective on this question. You're on the front lines. Your head's down. You're working in this capacity and have been for years. And here, the perception from perhaps those of us on the outside, if you will, like Erin and I, for instance, we cover the space and we talk to guys like you all the time, but we're not heads down, doing it. And so our perception, perhaps the public's perception, is that over the course of the past 12 to 18 months, given the situation that the world is in, it appears as though the pace of regulatory activity has sort of sped up. Maybe that's just because of the elephant in the room. But what's your perception of that? Does it feel? I mean, do you not just feel but see and do you see a quickening of the pace in recent months?
I think there's certainly a quickening of the pace. I would say, if you think of it as a funnel, there's a lot of activities going on, but there's still a bit of a bottleneck at the agency of now having the resources to review and analyze all the information and requests coming at them. And I think, with COVID, we saw, obviously there's a pandemic, so that gets raised to the top of the priority list for, all of our good and, hopefully a return to normal in the near future. But that's where the resource push was moved in order to accommodate all of the investigations to how do we produce a vaccine? How do we produce tests? How do we produce a quicker test or at a home test? And that certainly takes a lot of priority to get society back to normal. And for those of us not in the vaccine game, we still have our internal timelines of whether it's development or marketed product interactions with the agency that we queue up and try to get time. And I think, what's happened is, obviously everything changed to remote or virtual meetings or interactions with the agency. We have now gotten, not only these remote meetings, but written feedback on our questions and our meeting prep. And we've kind of had to fight with some timeline shifts because of the priority of the COVID vaccines and devices that have been put into place. So I think we've had to kind of shift some of our expectations just based on the agency's ability to accommodate our interactions that we need to proceed.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah, you mentioned certainly, of course, EMA, FDA throughout the course of our talk so far, and rightfully so. Biopharma being the global, game that it is, how do the varying requirements of these associations, EMA, FDA, what have you, how do they exacerbate the challenges associated with your job? I would imagine it's constantly paying attention to the data, the nitty gritty. What does your role look like every day based on the changes that go on right in the regulatory environment from a global perspective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and often I think isn't appreciated by those working in Europe or the US, because that's our focus. Those are two of the largest markets in the world. What we look at is, obviously we have ICH, which frankly provided a nice general platform for requirements for drug development that many countries across the world follow, which led to the common technical document and how to organize that information. So that's great for the countries that accept submissions in that format, and we're able to provide our development and drug information in a standardized way to those countries. And I think that's where that part of my job and the regulatory folks that work on that's the easy part of we have the same thing we can submit to multiple places. Then as you get to the non-ICH countries that have their specific requirements, that's where a lot more of the legwork and analysis comes in. So, how do we map their requirements to the ICH, ECTD, or CTD format? And can we make a match? And then, that's great. It's less work. For those requirements that don't fall into the common technical document, it's, do we already have it, but in a different format or a different place, and we can repurpose it, or do they need something new? So it's really developing the template and the strategy to try to piece that together And of course, that's ongoing. I think there's countries that are adopting the ICH-CTD format, which is great for us. But there's others that aren't there. So, and they continuously evolve their thinking for regulations because they need to protect their patients and their population of their country. So I think that's ongoing work. And frankly, it's just fascinating to get there. I guess I can give you an example. Working in an affiliate model at a past company, where we were supporting expansion to support Latin America, Asia, Africa. And you go into it from a US or European perspective with a certain assumption of the framework and regulations that might be involved. And often it's a little bit different. You find out that the published requirements are there. However, there's some nuances that you learn as you work with the regulators over time. So your local regulatory team becomes incredibly important because they'll say, oh yeah, requirement 121, it says this, but they're really asking for B. It's like, okay, I'm glad you're here. So we can provide that ahead of time. And, of course, there's different strategies to think about that of, are we going to tailor our dossiers specifically for the country? Or are we going to kind of send out a general one and we'll just deal with the questions from the health authorities as they come? And I think, companies have used a mixture of each approach to be successful in either case.
That's an interesting, anecdote. When I started covering this space, it was only 18 months ago. I sort of had it pounded over my head by a mentor of mine that the FDA is the gold standard, and if you meet FDA regulatory requirements, you're pretty well covered. So I'm curious because since then, as I've learned a little bit more and been studying the space, particularly the space you're in, cell and gene therapy, I've read some reports that indicate that perhaps the UK is poised to even overtake the US in terms of clinical capacity and activity on the cell and gene front. So I guess that leads to a follow-up question to the point you just made. Do you consider the FDA sort of the gold standard still? Do you see that changing at all? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here. I don't want you to speak disparagingly of the agency, of course, but just curious on your take there.
I think saying the FDA is the gold standard is pretty typical. I think a lot of health authorities still continuously look at FDA for trends, for what they're thinking, and often follow. I think the biggest arguments you may get is from the EMA, perhaps, Health Canada and others, PMDA in Japan. But I think in terms of setting precedent, in terms of drug review expectations for information and data, I think FDA is still leading the way. But you're now seeing more collaboration between the health authorities, which I think is a great step forward. So you have at the consortium with, I think, Australia, Singapore, Canada, and Switzerland to review dossiers together. And there's more cooperation between EMA and FDA. And I think that's going to continue. And if you look at that moving forward, that does nothing but help the patients, because if we can accelerate the time of review, that helps get drugs to market quicker for those patients. It also helps reduce some of the redundant work that like our publishing or operations team does, because often we're repackaging 90 to 95% of the same information in slightly different ways for different health authorities. So if we're able to submit the same dossier to 4, that helps them conduct the review and us potentially get that product and therapy to market for our patients quicker. So hopefully that thought process continues to evolve.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. This April, Cytiva celebrates 1 year in the biopharma industry. 12 groundbreaking and revolutionary months working to navigate and overcome the worst viral pandemic in a century. In recognizing this key milestone, we have the opportunity to reflect on lessons learned and identify ways to innovate, adapt, and improve. To help drive this progress, visit Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator and check out a selection of helpful resources for biotech leaders at cytiva.com/emergingbiotech. One of the other interesting, I think, observations that we've seen over the course of the last 18 to 24 months, pick your time, is the volume of new modalities, new molecules coming to bear and meeting, the agency stage. So I'm curious about your experience there. How does the experience of bringing something perhaps entirely new versus bringing forth a therapy that has some sort of a precedent or a parallel or an analog, for instance, and this is a big question. I mean, you could probably talk all day about this, but give me the highlights. What are the big differences between those two experiences?
So Matt, you hit on something that is part of the rationale of why I came to Bluebird. Mm-hmm. It's the gene therapy area of, something new that we were bringing as a therapy to treat patients, and something new in terms of what the health authorities are learning. They're learning the science as we are, and they're also learning what do we need to evaluate these therapies. Can we use some of the past precedents in other therapeutic areas to help us with those reviews and analysis of gene therapy? And how do we, frankly, try to partner with industry to learn more so we make the right decisions for the patient population? I think that's, with my regulatory colleagues at Bluebird, have done a wonderful job of partnering with the agencies to help bridge that gap, because the agency obviously sees a need for those patient populations, and we also want to help them get there so we can get the products to market. So I think there's a bit of educating and understanding that that the health authority has an obligation to protect the public safety first and foremost. So we have to be respectful of that, but also we have to help make risk-based decisions for new technology, new therapies to get to market. So I think it's certainly a give and take, but it's helping the health authority get there. And I think within the last year, you've seen several regulations and guidance documents from FDA come out about gene therapy, helping set the guardrails of what they expect as they've learned from companies like Bluebird and others that are in the gene therapy space.
Nice. I want to revisit something we talked about earlier in terms of the impact that COVID has had, just in general, but certainly over the sector. You mentioned that, certainly, of course, resources had to be allocated to, combat COVID in the most obvious ways. But specifically with you and your colleagues and the relationship with other regulators, how has COVID, impacted regulatory activity? Specifically, like I said, as it applies to you and your relationship with other regulators?
Yeah. So there are going to be some sort of tangible and intangible things to my answer, just to prep you for that. As I've talked to some of my regulatory strategy colleagues about this. So, first and foremost, it's just access to the health authorities for meetings. So, and typically you'd go into a meeting, there'd be meeting prep, you'd travel together, you'd attend the meeting, and, prior to the meeting, often you're waiting outside the meeting room and you have a chance to informally talk to your counterparts at the agency. Informally, you'd go in for the meeting, and then after the meeting, you would have some time to kind of debrief a little bit before you split. And what I heard is a lot of those informal conversations were really helpful. And whether that helps with clarifying questions that we have or clarifying information that was exchanged in the meeting, it just helps to have an agreement in the path forward after those exchanges. And what's happened since COVID is everything's been on a video conference or has been written feedback, which means you don't have a chance for kind of those small follow-up interactions, and it feels much more formal in terms of the interaction with the health authority. Also, the questions need to be very specific and targeted to what we want to know, because if we're getting written feedback, there's not an opportunity for a follow-up question or two to say, oh, that's how you took that question. This is where we wanted to go. and
Right.
to get that specificity in the answer. So I think that exchange and that relationship probably suffers a little bit because of just being virtual, which we've still been able to get through it, but I think the reg strategists kind of miss that interaction that they have face to face with the regulator. The other impact has also been on inspections. So oftentimes the inspections will happen at our clinical sites, and at times those were hospitals. So with COVID, a lot of the non-COVID interactions at a hospital have been postponed for months. I think hospitals might be more willing to allow folks to come in for those inspection activities, but those have been delayed, or that are happening virtually, which just presents challenges if you have to view something through a camera or a phone or something to see certain aspects of the clinical site through that lens. So I think that's where some of the difficulty with COVID has come in, but it's been managed. And I think the good thing is the health authority has been very upfront with it, and they said here's our priority. Here's where timelines might slip. We understand it's difficult to sometimes schedule time with your investigator sites if they're at hospitals, and we'll adjust our timelines as needed. But there's been a really clear dialogue of expectations. So I think that we've managed through it in a partnership as best as possible.
Yeah. So clearly some disruption for companies like Bluebird, but at the same time, on the other side of the coin, the agency has been applying sort of flexing some speed and agility muscle that we haven't seen before as it relates to COVID vaccine and therapeutic candidates and approvals. So I'm naive and optimistic. I'm wondering if you're at all naive, or perhaps we'll just leave it at optimistic, about the potential that some of that speed and agility and flexible thinking will bleed over to other therapeutic areas like yours as things return to some semblance of normalcy.
Matt, I would certainly like to say I'm an optimist in this point. I think when you go through an experience like this and realize how quickly you can adapt to change, that hopefully you take those lessons and you move those forward into other aspects of whether it's another therapeutic area or another area within FDA or any health authority. Also, I'd look internally to us of what have we learned at Bluebird about our ability to quickly flex and shift due to COVID over the past year. Mm-hmm. And I think we want to carry those lessons forward. Another, I guess, small anecdote is we're just implementing a document management system. And along with the technology aspects of that, there's a change management aspect of that, of changing people's ways of working. And one of our proposals of communication was, 10 months ago, we shifted from a very in-person meeting interaction style at Bluebird to a completely remote one based on virtual technology, and we were able to do that successfully, with some bumps here and there, of course, but maintain business continuity pretty well. And if we're able to make a change that big, storing your files in a doc management system versus a SharePoint site isn't that big of a leap. So we can do it together. So just trying to reinforce that look. When you're going through it, it seems like a big deal. But once you've mastered that change, you kind of forget about, what you went through, and hopefully kind of helping, our folks internally have that same perspective on future change. And I hope, seeing the health authorities have a similar mindset would be great.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. So I just want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Bluebird Bio's pipeline, but really just in terms of the regulatory activity. What, from your perspective, will be going on from a regulatory perspective as it applies to Bluebird's pipeline?
Sure, Erin. We actually have a really exciting 1 to 2 years coming up for us from a regulatory perspective. So actually this week, we have a PDUFA date coming up for our multiple myeloma product that we're co-developing with BMS. And hopefully we have some very successful news on Friday, and that would be great because that'd be our first US approval. Then we are currently under review in Europe for our adrenoleukodystrophy product. So I think that we'll have a response on later this year. And then second half of the year, we have 2 filings for FDA. And then next year, our sickle cell drug will be filed. So there's a lot going on. It's exciting. I think one of the great things that we do at Bluebird is really connect the patients to what we're doing. And hearing the patient stories for these rare diseases is, just wants us to be successful in bringing these to market. And part of my job is making sure we have the processes and technology to get us there with the regulators, which is just a really cool part of helping our patients with what's afflicting them.
Yeah, I'm sure it feels good.
What's so you kind of covered the next big, I wanted to ask you what the next big steps for Bluebird are, and if there are more, you can share them. But I just had a follow-up question based on what you just said around processes and systems for regulatory compliance. So I'll throw this at you. The bulk of our audience for this pod is new and emerging biopharma leaders, many of them preclinical, many of them filing INDs for the first time, first in human studies, seeing it for the first time. As it relates to those processes and systems, what is your best advice for your counterpart at a much newer, much earlier stage biopharma than Bluebird?
So my advice is to, and it's going to sound generic at first, but then I'll dive in a little bit, is to really start with the end in sight of where do you want to be in terms of, process systems that's going to be right size for your company. So I'll take a step back and explain a little bit. So if you look at trying to put in a doc management process that you emphasize the need for templates and standards, and then having folks store those into a doc management system. So your publishing team, whether that's internal or external, can take those documents in order to publish your submissions in a timely way and compliant way is going to make you successful. So trying to think about the process and the technology of where you want to be, because the hardest part is to kind of allow sort of a free-for-all. And non-clinical folks, you have your own templates, you create your documents as you want. Your CMC folks, you do what you want, and then trying to expect those to all come together at the end is really hard. And I think what's lost when you're starting up is sort of that cycle time. So as your documentation and data get to that publishing step, if it's not correctly formatted, if there are content errors when it's reviewed at that time, now you go back and start that authoring review process again, which just adds to your timeline. So if you try to build in, first time right concepts with the right tools, and it doesn't have to be this, huge overhead of processes, systems, tools, et cetera. But, if you start with simple things that help you be successful, that's going to help your process be successful, and it's going to decrease that time at the end that everyone's concerned about in terms of review and publishing and creating electronic files and transmission. That's going to help you be successful quicker.
Yeah. Sound advice there. Start with some notes on the back of a napkin if that's where you need to start, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Any other news at Bluebird you wanted to share with us, Scott, before we part ways?
I think for us, kind of as I mentioned, we're in the process of building out our technology stack, and I think going back a couple questions ago of looking at where health authorities are leading from and what their priorities are, you see this overwhelming focus on data. and how do we provide them with granular data for our studies, for our manufacturing process, et cetera. And what we're looking at Bluebird is not only from a doc management perspective, but from a labeling perspective, our clinical studies of how do we accurately develop our data model? How do we pull that into our systems? So our eTMF system connects to our regulatory information management system, to our ad promo system. So we have this consistent set of metadata and information that we can use across our systems and provide that in a compliant and consistent way to the health authority. So, as another side note, a past company had 14 places where the company address was a piece of master data. So 14 different systems had the same piece of information, and there was variety in what that information was between the 14. So if you look at the information that EMA is going to require as part of IDMP or SPOR, what's our system of record? What's that data point that we're always going to source from? And how do we ensure that's consistent across the organization? Mm-hmm. And that's really where we're trying to go with looking at our system. So not only enhancing how we become more efficient, effective, compliant, but also how do we use our data as a benefit for the organization and for our successful interactions with health authorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that sounds like a big project. And let me ask you a follow-up question on that, because I think it might be instructive for our audience that I mentioned earlier. As you sort of source the components of this data build out, and I don't expect you to give me vendor names, but are you turning to the IT vendor community, the life sciences IT vendor community for big portions of these projects, or are you building internally? Is it homegrown? Is it a hybrid of both? Just give us some flavor as to how the components are sort of coming together.
Yeah, we are absolutely working with partners, and I think that's critical to our success, especially as a smaller biotech. We don't want to become software engineers. We don't want to rebuild some of these solutions that have industry best practices in them. And I think finding the right vendor sets, and frankly, we have one vendor that works throughout our clinical, regulatory, commercial organizations, and that helps us build a consistent system across the organization, hopefully connects those data points. And also, if you look at the vendor community, they're working across industry, so they're building best practices into their product, which we can benefit from. And the great part about that is if it's built into their product, there's less testing and revalidation we have to do, because we're doing less customizations or fewer configurations, and that out-of-the-box product allows us to get these tools into our users' hands more quickly, and hopefully that makes us more efficient in the end.
Cool. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there you go. Lean on your vendors, folks. Awesome. Well, that's terrific. I think this has been a super informative discussion, Scott. I appreciate the time you spent with us. I feel like we're out of time, but I feel like we're just getting started. I'd love to have you back. Perhaps we can talk at a later date about the implementation of some of these IT projects you're working on there and how it's working out for you. But I'd love to have you back on the show sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Erin, it was a pleasure. Always happy to share. And things will certainly change, even if it's not our IT projects. I'm sure there'll be some other upcoming initiative, regulation, hopefully not a pandemic that we have.
Amen to that. Okay. So that's Scott Cleve and Erin Harris. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is The Business of Biotech. If you liked what you heard, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share the pod with your colleagues. Erin and I would also be thrilled if you'd visit cellandgene.com and bioprocessonline.com to sign up for our always relevant and never spammy newsletters. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with our friends at Cytiva, a company dedicated to supporting new and emerging biopharmas on the journeys through the clinic and beyond. Check Cytiva out at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. We'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.